Okay, well, thank you, Mary, for the introduction. I'm Mary Ann Carosi, Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon, Florida, based out of Tallahassee. I live about 10 miles west of Tallahassee, and I've been listening to all of you talk about your feeder birds. I'm jealous about the orioles, but I have had up to 60 purple finches at my feeders this winter. So I've been really enjoying the purple finches. So I guess we all have something special no matter where we are in the state. Predominantly I manage, most of my time goes into managing coastal birds, coastal bird stewardship, but a really fun part of my job is working with the Florida Scrub Jays and the Jay Watch program. Mary asked me to talk about translocation of scrub jays, which is a very recent, well, I can't say it's recent. There's been some research in the past, and I will go over that, and then I'll talk about the current status of research on translocation in Florida as a means of restoring genetic diversity in Florida, isolated Florida scrub jay populations. Next slide. So first, for all of you who are not really familiar with Florida scrub jays, I want to give you some background that'll be important to the second part of my presentation tonight. Florida scrub jays are and remain federally threatened. They were listed as federally threatened in 1987 because of loss of habitat and dramatic population declines. This is a non-migratory bird species. Florida scrub jays live in Florida year-round. And what's really important, I've put in red here, it's going to be important later on in our discussion, they rarely move more than 2 miles from where they hatched. They are territorial year-round, a little bit looser on the territorial bit in the non-breeding season than they are in the nesting season. Next slide. The current population has dropped considerably from what it was historically. Best estimates are that there were once upon a time close to 40,000 Florida scrub jays in the state. At present, there are maybe 8,000 birds. There hasn't been a census done statewide on conservation land since 2009 and 10. The results were published in 2011. I was working with Archbold and U.S. Fish and Wildlife last year to organize a statewide census, and that fell apart partly because of COVID and partly because of funding. And continuity. So we were not able to get another updated statewide census complete last year. So we really don't know at this point, 10 years out of date, what the current population is. Next slide. Also important to the discussion later on is that Florida scrub jays are among the 2% of the 10,000 plus bird species on planet Earth that are cooperative breeders. What that means for Florida scrub jays is that at the core of each family group, what we call family groups, there's a pair of breeding adults, and there can be up to 6 adult helper birds. The function of the helper birds is to defend territory along with the breeding pair, particularly during nesting season, and also to help feed and protect the nestlings after the eggs have hatched. And they also provide food for the juveniles once they're out of the nest and the nest tree until they reach independence at about 85 days post-hatching, so about 3 months. Next slide. If you're out and about looking at Florida scrub jays, there's a key time of year when you can tell adults and juveniles apart. Primarily that's April, May, June, July. Sometimes late hatching juveniles can still be identified as juveniles in early August. The key to telling the difference is the back of the head and the back of the neck. In the adults, you'll notice blue heads, blue back of the neck. You'll see a sort of a silver gray patch on the upper back, and then blue wings. On the juveniles, you also see the blue wings, but you see brown on the top of the head and the back of the neck. So this is a family group with 3 adults and 3 juveniles. Next slide. During the nesting season, scrub jays eat primarily arthropods. Caterpillars are a favorite, but also insects and spiders. They'll eat frogs, toads, lizards, basically anything that's smaller than they are that they can catch. And that is the food that has to be fed to the young birds, the nestlings and the juveniles, in order for them to grow properly. Peanuts, not really a good food for juveniles. Too much fiber, not enough protein. So it is, I have to put this in here, it is pretty detrimental to juvenile birds to feed scrub jays peanuts during the nesting season. In the non-breeding season, what the scrub jays do, this is end of the summer, so going into September, October, they begin harvesting acorns off the scrub oaks and burying them or caching them. One Florida scrub jay can literally bury or cache up to 8,000 acorns in the fall months. This is their winter food supply. When insects are in short supply in the colder months, Florida scrub jays can remember where up to 80% of the acorns are that they buried, that they cached, and they'll go and dig them up and eat them when they're hungry. It's really a fascinating life history. Next slide. So habitat, which is one of the key things about growing populations of Florida scrub jays. Optimal habitat is low scrub oaks. There are 3 to 4 species of scrub oaks in Florida, depending on whether you're in coastal area or the Lake Wales Ridge. Sparse trees, very, very few trees. The trees are predator perches for great horned owls and barred owls and Cooper's hawks, and swallowtail kites are actually predators of Florida scrub jays as well. Especially, well, when they have young in their nest, they will also catch anything that's food and take it to their young. What is really critically important, in addition to the low and open oak shrub cover, are these open sandy patches. This is where the birds cache their acorns. When these patches become covered with grass, grass has root mass. So especially sod-forming grasses like pasture grasses, very detrimental to scrub jay habitat because they can't pound those acorns into the sand through that root network. So the open, bare, sandy patches are a critical part of optimal scrub jay habitat. Next slide. Overgrown habitat. This is what it looks like. The scrub oaks are tall, the sand pines are tall and numerous, and there are very few bare sand patches left. Typically in overgrown habitat, you only find the bare sand on the roads, the sand roads that access the properties, and maybe on the fire breaks too. This type of dense overgrown habitat is just a great place for Cooper's hawks. And snakes and raccoons and all types of predators that will take nestlings and young naive scrub jays. So very detrimental to population scrub jays. Next slide. From very early on, and you can look at the date on this table, 1969 to 1978 data. That is how long ago collectively we have known that more young fledge in better in open and low scrub habitat than overgrown habitat, and also the survival of juvenile scrub jays through their fall, their first winter into their first spring, much higher when the habitat is low and open than when it's overgrown. One of the earliest things established about the life histories of scrub jays. Next slide. So why is that? So this is a little, I'll walk you through this. So on the left side of the graph, the upper half is optimal habitat, good habitat, that's the low and open. The bottom is the half is the dense overgrown habitat. So in the stage when adult scrub jays are incubating eggs, they spend about the same amount of time searching for food and in vigilance, looking for predators as in good habitat and overgrown habitat. It's about the same. There's really no difference at the egg stage. Next slide. But once those eggs hatch and there are nestlings, what the adults and the helper birds need to be doing is out searching for food to feed those growing nestlings so they can raise as many young to fledgling as possible. But in overgrown habitat, they are so busy looking for predators, searching for predators, being attentive to unusual sounds and noises. And this is very real. Their worries are real, as it were. Cooper's hawks love overgrown habitat. So they end up spending too much time in vigilance and not enough time feeding the young, and they have very low productivity. Small, much lower numbers of young that are fledged in overgrown habitat. Next slide. So this sensitivity to habitat condition is what makes Florida scrub jays be given the notation of being an umbrella species. They're a great habitat condition indicator. What's good habitat for Florida scrub jays is also good habitat for around 55, 6, 7 other federally and state listed animals and plants. So this is really important Florida, uniquely Florida habitat. And scrub jays are up there at the top of the food web and really good indicators of optimal habitat. Next slide. So how do we keep it optimal? Well, historically it was lightning that did it. Lightning is what is responsible for maintaining the open nature of Florida dry prairie, as well as Florida scrub, pine flatwoods, longleaf pine. All these native Florida habitats were born out of lightning strikes and lightning ignited fires. Next slide. But we no longer allow lightning ignited fires to burn across the landscape for obvious reasons, highways, homes, commercial areas. So what has to happen now is the planning and execution of prescribed burns. For scrub habitat, the fire return interval ranges anywhere from 5 to 20 years, very wide range. For pine flatwoods, they like to have it burned every 3 years or so. Florida dry prairie, they like to have it burned every 1 to 2 years. So scrub is very different on the longer end. Coastal areas get more rainfall, and so they have to burn more frequently. Inland areas like on the Lake Wales Ridge in Highlands County, they burn at longer rotations, 8 to 12 years typically, or longer. Next slide. So on the left, you see on the ground, that's pine needle duff. That stuff accumulates, you know, it's part of the natural, the part of the ecosystem, but it does accumulate and it covers that, those nice open, bare, sandy patches. You burn all that off along with a lot of other vegetation and grass, and you have, once again, open low habitat, lots of beautiful white sand for the scrub jays to cache their acorns in. Next slide. So other than prescribed fire, when habitat is very densely overgrown, sometimes mechanical means have to be used to reduce the height of the vegetation, especially a lot of trees. This is a hydro axe. There's also roller, roller chopping, disking, that kind of equipment can be used. Next slide. But there's also the good old chainsaw method of reducing pine. This is a project that Audubon and the Florida Trail Association carried out maybe about 4 or 5 years ago at Little Manatee South Fork Reserve in Manatee County. It's Swiftmud property. So you see that before and after, that's a lot of hard work, but it was a lot of fun for the volunteers. Post-COVID, I'm hoping we can do more of that. Next slide. So to give you all an idea of the population status by county, and of course you can take a look at Manatee County as this was as of 2019, 21 to 40 groups. There may be more than that. If that was updated to 2020. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But so the gray area up in the Panhandle in very northern Florida, there are no historic records that Florida scrub jays ever existed in those counties. So this really is a uniquely Florida bird, very special bird. And also in Monroe County, they call it, the Florida Keys in Southwest Florida. There are no records of Florida scrub jays. Next slide. So within those counties, I want you to recognize, and most of you all of you who are birders know that just because, it says that is a certain bird is in a certain county, it doesn't mean it's everywhere in the county. So Florida scrub jays occupy the sandy ridges, which are ancient coastal dunes, basically. You can see the linear nature of several of these areas so this is, I'm not on there. The north central area is Ocala National Forest. The south central area is largely the Lake Wales Ridge. And then the East Coast, yeah, there you go. Thanks, Mary. The eastern coast, the Atlantic Coastal Ridge, and then the very northern part, Merritt Island and Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Next slide. Actually, go back. Can you go back? I'm sorry. I did want to point out Manatee County. Notice that the scrub jays locations in Manatee County are all in the eastern, pretty much in the eastern areas, and Hillsborough in the southern areas. Okay, next slide. The 3 remaining strongholds, largest populations in the state are in Ocala National Forest, roughly 1,000 to 1,200 family groups of scrub jays. The second largest population is Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge and Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. There are probably at least 500 family groups there. And then in the Lake Wales Ridge area, there's another at least 500 family groups. And that's on multiple properties. They're all fairly close together, but nevertheless, not one big property. Next slide. So how many Florida scrub jay families does it take to have a stable population? So this was research done by John Fitzpatrick, who's, I think, just retired as the executive director of Cornell Lab of Ornithology. He did his research, and he's probably still coming back to, he spends a lot of time at Archbold Biological Station on his vacations, and probably will retire down there.
I like the bird, but I'm having trouble focus.
So for small numbers, properties that have small numbers of jays, 1 to 10, they're at risk. On the upper end, it takes at least 40 family groups to have a fairly stable population, and probably more than that to prevent inbreeding. That would be in the absence of jays coming in from off the property. So in other words, if there were only 40 families, let's say, and no other birds immigrating, probably you would start to see inbreeding after a while. Next slide. So in 2008, there was a paper published that delineated genetic units of Florida scrub jays. These are significantly different genetically, but not so different that they are subspecies or species, separate species. They're lettered here, and I've put some notes here on the slide that B, C, and D, the ones that I talked about before, Ocala National Forest, and other sites, Seminole State Forest, some other sites, Merritt Island and Lake Wales Ridge are the most stable populations, the largest, most diverse genetically, and the largest numbers. Genetic unit F, which is the one in your area, Southern Hillsborough, Manatee, Eastern Sarasota County, relatively stable. There are a lot of folks that are putting high hopes on this population F, genetic unit F, growing and becoming one of the, the most stable and larger populations in the state. The others are at risk. All of the others are at risk. I'm going to talk a little bit more about I, which is in the southeastern part of the state along the coast, in a few slides upcoming. It's Cedar Key at H is all but extirpated. There are only like one scrub jay here and one jay there, reported by local people. Occasionally I get an email saying I saw a scrub jay. None on Cedar Key Scrub Preserve anymore. So those are all but gone. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about what is translocation. Basically, translocation is moving animals from one site to another site. You have to capture them, transport them, and release them on another site. Two purposes of translocation. It can be used to reintroduce animals to what we believe is a suitable habitat where there are no other scrub jays. Translocation is much more often used to augment an existing scrub jay population where there is unoccupied habitat that's in good condition. The thing is that scrub jays are very gregarious and they like to be around other birds. They can be trapped using two different types of traps. The upper left is potter traps. They have a door that you hold, you can anchor it open. You put peanuts in there, you let the scrub jays come and go at will and eat all the peanuts they want until the day that you're going to capture them. And then you put the peanuts in there and you let the jays go inside, and then you remotely trigger the door of the cage and it traps the jays inside, which does not make them very happy. The lower left shows what's called a drop trap. It's a real basic type of trap. It's a box of wire, hardware cloth, and that stick there holds the trap up. It's got a string attached to it or twine. And when the jays are underneath the trap in the right position, somebody just yanks the stick out and it traps the birds in there. A little more primitive trap. Next slide. So after you capture the jays, they're transported to a recipient site. I'm sure you'll recognize the cages there on the left, the crates. Work has been done to test whether it increases the likelihood that the birds will remain by using hacking cages. In other words, putting them in cages and letting them become used to the sights and sounds and their surroundings, or whether they can be released immediately. If they're kept in hacking cages, they have to be fed a proper diet. So it's much higher maintenance method. Next slide. And then after you release the birds, regardless of what method you've used, whether hacking cages or immediate release, there's a lot of effort that goes into post-release monitoring to find out whether the translocated birds stay on the site or whether they leave. If they leave, if they disappeared, were they depredated? You know, did something kill and eat them? Which you probably won't find the remains if that happened. But typically surrounding areas of scrub will be searched too to see if they can find them. They're all banded, by the way, before they're released so that they can be definitively identified. And then the big question is, will they breed with other unrelated birds on the new site? Next slide. So a little bit about the history. Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. Most people are familiar with their offshore islands, but they actually own mainland area of flatwoods, and it's scrubby flatwoods. So way back when, 1989 to 1995, 20 scrub jays were moved to that site. There were no scrub jays on the site when the jays were translocated there. And I learned recently that there never had been any records of Florida scrub jays at the site. So there was scrub habitat, but apparently it was unoccupied historically. But a group of people decided that they wanted to try it, reintroducing the jays to that area of apparently suitable scrub habitat. So 50%, nearly 50% of the birds disappeared within the first 8 weeks. And over time, all of them either were depredated or dispersed or whatever. So by the late 1990s, you know, there weren't any jays left. So that was considered a failure. I've gotten requests from Rookery Bay volunteers that would like to have their very own population of scrub jays back again, if wanting to know if it's possible to try reintroducing them again. And I refer them to the Fish and Wildlife Commission with that request. It's unlikely. It was a failed experiment, and without any jays, any records that jays had ever lived there, it's unlikely that it would be successful if tried again. Next slide. So another experiment, Lake Monroe is in Volusia County. So that's where Daytona Beach is on the coast, but this is an inland site. It's owned and managed by St. Johns River Water Management District. 8 birds were translocated from the Deltona property as lots were being developed to Lake Monroe in 2011. And you can see on this table here, they were introduced in 2011. You see the number of groups bumped from 5 to 6, a couple of more adults, but you don't see any change over the time. And in fact, we've seen declines over time. So they stopped reintroducing jays because it wasn't, I don't know, they didn't have the source or didn't think it was going to work. Next slide. This was a longer experiment. Buck Lake Conservation Area is also owned and managed by St. Johns River Water Management District. It is in northwestern Brevard County. 25 acres is the answer to Lillian's question. So 12 jay families, 42 birds were translocated over a period of 7 years. And you can look at the numbers and see it rise, see the number of birds rise, you know, from 2010, 12, 14, 15, And then, you know, after 2015, the last introduction, you see those numbers start to drop off. The 2020 census, there is 1 bird left on this site. So out of 42 birds that were translocated, either one that was an offspring of a resident or 1 translocated bird is still alive. So this is a sort of, it's very perplexing. Really, there aren't good answers about why the birds didn't take at this site. What it shows us is something that, you know, we as humans and bright, you know, intelligent humans doing research don't want to see, which is that the birds have a different perception of what's optimal habitat than we do. So there's something about this habitat that the birds perceive as unsuitable. It's been burned. It's not that. It's not about whether the habitat has been maintained. It's been maintained to the optimal standards that, you know, in the current state of thought. So we just don't really know. Red ants could be a factor, but unlikely to be pervasive over the entire property. It's a little bit wet, and the wetness may have something to do with it. Next slide. So closer to home for you all in Tampa, Audubon, this is actually one of the big success stories. So like Mosaic or not like Mosaic, they did cooperate with permit required mitigation. 51 birds were translocated to Duet Preserve and the Mosaic Wellfield, which is just on the south side of Duet, between 2007 and 2011. Duet Preserve initially had 1 or 2 breeding pairs. It is a very unusual type of habitat. There are scrub patches out embedded in a habitat that looks more like dry prairie to me, to my eye. It's a lot of sable palm, you know, saw palmetto and grass and what have you. But there are viable scrub patches all over the property. Population as of last year was 36 breeding pairs. And some of the young that were hatched and banded on this property are known to have dispersed off the property to other sites. So this is it's a big success story. There's a big population out there at Duet Preserve that is really thriving. The birds move around across the landscape and helpers change families, and it's really, it's a big success story. Next slide. So current research. Carl Miller is the research biologist from Florida FWC who is overseeing this whole project. There are a lot of people involved. Dr. Nancy Chen is doing genetic work. Dr. Sarah Fitzpatrick, who is John Fitzpatrick's daughter, who is at Michigan State, is doing genetic work. Archbold is involved in the population monitoring at the sites. And of course, Carl Miller is the one who is identifying what birds are going to be captured and translocated out of Ocala National Forest to these other lands. So through last year, 40 birds were translocated, have been translocated to Seminole State Forest, which is just south of Ocala National Forest, so same genetic unit. I want to make that point. Rock Springs Run, which is on the north side of Wekiva Springs State Park in Orlando, 24 birds have been translocated there. Again, this is the same genetic unit as Ocala National Forest. So part of the experiment is to move birds within the same genetic unit. But the last set there, Jonathan Dickinson State Park, this is a big deal experiment. They've moved 8 birds as of last year. This is a very different genetic unit from the source population of Ocala National Forest. It's isolated way at the edge of the state, declining population. what was attractive about Jonathan Dickinson, excuse me, the researchers, is that the park biologists there, Rob Rossmanith and others, have been doing tremendous amount of great work restoring overgrown habitat. And so the birds that were there began to spread out, but they have managed to rehabilitate, restore a lot of habitat. So there was suitable unoccupied habitat there. It's really being managed well. So the Archbold FWC team said, hey, you know, this could be good, but we're going to start with a small number of birds. The tests are, in addition to within versus among different genetic units, the tests are whether or not they have to, you know, family groups are the only viable way to translocate birds, or whether they could take what are called hatchier birds, so juvenile young birds, basically in the first fall, first winter, birds that are not quite 1 year old, and move them separately from family groups. So next slide. So here's the status. This is Seminole State Forest. So just, you know, kind of wade through this table here. So there were 4 pairs of jays moved in 2017 and 2018 to Seminole State Forest, which is right next to Ocala National Forest. 2 pairs in 2019, total of 20 birds. There were 3 birds, one in 2017, one in 2018, one in 2019, that were family helpers, one per each of the one helper per one of the families that was moved in the left column. They also captured single hatchier birds, young birds, 8 in 2019 and 4 in 20. So they've moved 12 birds that were not associated with a family group. They, you know, in their first fall or winter, they were very loosely associated. So as of July 2020, you see how many birds are left. So 10 of the 20 birds that were paired adults. But in the bottom row, you see that those birds over time, the paired adults, have produced 15 fledglings. Contrast that with the 12 single young birds that were moved. 5 birds, you know, 7 birds are gone, and none of those have bred successfully. So it's this data set here, it gives some fairly strong evidence that moving paired adults with or without family helpers is the way to go. Next slide. So a little bit more about Jonathan Dickinson State Park. So you can see, I don't know, Mary, with your cursor, north of those. So the Tran family was the breeding pair with the female helper that was the first group translocated from Ocala National Forest to Jonathan Dickinson State Park. And they released the birds close to where the majority of the other birds were. Again, they're gregarious birds, and they thought this was the best chance. They'll have neighbors, you know, and of course, the fact that other scrub jays are there provides what's called habitat cues. It tells the new residents, the new arrivals, that, hey, this is pretty good, you know, habitat. We're living here, we're happy here, so you might be too. So it's a good cue for them to stick around and set up a family shop, so to speak. However, that first family that was transported in 2019, out of 4 nesting attempts, no eggs hatched. Both females left the territory in May 2019, so by close to the end of the nesting season. By May 2020, the female helper was paired with another male. I do not have any more recent information after that. There hasn't been another report published. The female that was part of the breeding pair is missing. So to the north of the Tran family, you notice you can see that scrub signature on the aerial map there. So there's a lot of unoccupied habitat that's in pretty good shape. And that's where they moved the next group. Next slide. So there were two additional groups moved in 2020. One breeding pair that had no helpers and one breeding pair that had a male helper. Again, apologies, there are no reports available. Fish and Wildlife Service, the researchers haven't released another report. It'll come in April, I think, this year. That's when they publish, is April each year, but only once a year. And it's research, so it's kind of secret. I guess that's what they tell me. So of the total 8 birds translocated to Jonathan Dickinson, this is to a different genetic unit, 7 have survived. And 2 of the helpers that were translocated, the male and female helpers, have paired with resident breeding birds as of last year. So this is the big deal. Can translocated birds breed successfully with genetically different mates? So that's what we're all, anxiously awaiting to see. I hate to leave y'all with that mystery, but okay, next slide. So to date, the case studies that have been done with translocation suggest that time of year matters a lot. They tried translocating jays in the late fall and winter. The thing is, the jays have already cached their winter food supply by then. So if you move jays, they don't have any acorns stowed. They don't have any acorns cached. They don't have a winter food supply. So they're dependent on whether or not they're, is it a warm winter? Are there enough insects to get through the year? So they've really changed techniques to capturing and translocating birds at the end of summer before the birds cache their acorns so that they do have their own winter food supply. Helper birds are good with families, whether they stay with the family or not. Translocating juveniles, not so much. Definitely whole family groups. Next slide. So Carl had some really interesting observations recently. We were talking, I wanted to share them to you. These are his 2, major observations about translocation. There's always a risk to the birds. It's tricky. There's a lot of stress during transport and after release. There's that risk that the birds won't settle, death, disease transmission, and also that translocation requires a lot of time and resources. Whether you put them in hacking cages like they did at Buck Lake Conservation Area and Lake Monroe, or you release them immediately, you still have to do a lot of preparation, trap training the birds, capturing them, transporting them, releasing them, and a lot of follow-up monitoring. So Carl's point is that translocation should only be conducted under specific conditions in particular landscapes where the potential conservation benefit is going to be highest. Next slide. So I wanted to show you an example of a focal landscape. These are really horrible maps. I can't make them any better. They're really, really detailed maps. There's a whole sequence of these maps, one for each of the genetic units. This is the northern part of the map that affects southern Hillsborough and Manatee County. So in the bottom right, there's a green area surrounded by blue. That is Duet Preserve. 43 family groups is the maximum potential for that property. The way they figure that out, for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing, is that they take the total number of acres of scrub habitat and multiply it by 0.7. So 70% of the habitat should be in optimal condition at all time. In other words, burned. And right height and open sand. And then they divide by 25 acres per family. And that's how you get that number. So each of these blobs on the map has a number. That's what that number is. So I put a red circle around one of them up in the upper left corner of the map. It has a number 7 in it. That's Golden Aster Scrub Preserve. In theory, if 70% of the almost 300 acres of scrub there was in optimal condition, at 25 acres per family group, there could be 7 family groups there on that property. To the east of that red circle, you'll see balm boyette scrub with a 21 on it. So in theory, 21 family groups could occupy the scrub habitat. I was looking at the question there. Sorry, I got distracted. So these focal landscapes are built out from mapping, a lot of mapping done by FWC, Archbold, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a lot of experts mapped every single site, every single scrub site that had any potential to support these larger populations. And these are the areas where in the federal recovery plan that they want to devote the most attention to these sites that show up on these maps. Next slide. So I wanted to give you an idea, just as I took this out of Google Earth. It's about 9 miles from Golden Aster to balm boyette scrub, and about 15 miles from Golden Aster to Moody Branch and Little Manatee South Fork. It's probably it's over 20 miles to Duet Preserve. So if you remember at the very beginning, I said that the vast majority of scrub jays never move farther than 2 miles from where they hatched. So think about this when you look at this. Think about reversing those arrows. Okay, so there are jays on Moody Branch and Little Manatee South Fork. That's a long way for them to move, to fly and find that basically little needle in a haystack that's Golden Aster Scrub Preserve. So the only way you're going to get more jays on Golden Aster is to grow them there, most likely, or translocate, but the habitat around Golden Aster is really not suitable. It's urbanized. Next slide. So I did, David Gordon from Quest Ecology has been working at Golden Aster. They were trying to capture and translocate the birds. The complication there was that the birds had been fed so many peanuts by people visiting that they could not capture them. They weren't interested, especially in the peanuts, and couldn't get them to go in the traps reliably enough that they could capture them. So there were 3 males, there are supposedly, they thought there were 3 males. There were 3 birds, I should have said, present until January 2019. Apparently one of them disappeared somewhere around January 2019. The 2 remaining evidently weren't males. There was a female there. They actually did mate and produced 2 fledglings. And after the first winter, the 2 of the 4 jays disappeared. David does not know whether those were the 2 juveniles or 1 adult and 1 juvenile, or the 2 adults. Most likely it was the young birds. They weren't banded, so there's no way to know which 2 left. There are still 2 there, apparently. Don't know whether they fledged any young last year. I would need, somebody to be out there to say. So right now there's still just 2 jays there as far as I was able to determine. Next slide. So this is one of the things, a little food for thought. I'm winding up my presentation here. Birds that are isolated in these small, that are living in isolated scrub families like a golden aster. The question that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and FWC researchers are pondering is whether or not, these could be very old birds. They do have unique, genetic makeup. They could be beneficial for augmenting larger populations where there, that are larger, more stable populations. However, the longer they're at these isolated sites, the older they get. So scrub jays don't live, the oldest known are 16 years old, but they're not breeding at that age. They breed maybe, 7 years, 9 years maybe, that's about it. So we know there have been 2 or 3 birds at golden aster for at least 6 years now. So we don't know how old those birds are. There's no way to know. So if they're old, they won't interbreed. Even if they're translocated, they won't interbreed with other birds. So does that make them valuable? It's a question. It's sort of a rhetorical question. Is it valuable to invest the time and energy in capturing them and translocating them and monitoring after they're moved? And the other thing is that these isolated families in urban settings have been exposed to peanuts, supplemental food, and not so suitable habitat, lots of predators. They may or may not adapt very well when they're translocated. Next slide. I think I'm about at the end. So to summarize, maintaining optimum habitat structure and condition still remains the absolute most important factor, far beyond all others, in increasing, the Florida scrub jay population statewide. Buying more habitat doesn't help unless the financial and resources are there to restore the habitat and then maintain it in optimal condition. The truth is there's a lot of already, conservation lands with scrub on it that's not being maintained properly. So if that was restored, existing conservation lands, there would be a lot more scrub available without purchasing additional lands. I'm not casting aspersions on buying additional scrub lands, however. So translocation is proving to be a useful tool. It's slow going, requires a lot of experimentation. There's a risk that researchers are considering carefully as far as moving birds to different genetic units. They don't want to just, release the birds and have them, dwindle and die, basically. You don't want to throw away scrub jays. They're valuable. Every single scrub jay is valuable. So they're translocating small numbers of birds. The issue of translocating small numbers of jays like a golden aster to other sites, it's not high on the radar, is what I have to tell you. It just requires a lot of effort. Now, having said that, there are people that are willing to do it, like David Gordon is willing to invest in doing that if the conditions are right. And then last but not least, interbreeding is necessary in the long run, even at Archbold Station. As the land around Archbold gradually develops, they're seeing fewer and fewer birds immigrating onto the Archbold property, and they are starting to see indications of inbreeding. And they have 90 family groups. So it's critically important that translocation start crossing these boundaries to restore genetic diversity over time. Otherwise, even the gradually larger and larger populations, we're going to start seeing inbreeding and decline. Last slide. That's a really, really young scrub jay that's not fledged yet, can't fly yet, baby scrub jay. One of my favorite photos. Just wanted to share that with you. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, thank you very, very much. That was excellent. Let's see. Well, I'm looking up chats here. One of the questions that I had, Marianne, is there any evidence that so you say that they will live beyond their breeding age. Would an old jay who was past breeding take the role of a helper with a younger pair, or do they just basically live on their own isolated?
That's a good question, even if they were translocated. So that's a good question. So translocated birds are not always accepted by families. In other words, if they want to leave their breeding pair, they may be, castaways. They may or may not be. The jays will either accept them, other family groups will either accept them or reject them. They'll drive them off. I don't know about an older bird. That's a really good question as to whether or not an older bird that was not of breeding age. So an older bird would not be perceived as a threat to a breeding pair, wouldn't stealing the mate, so to speak. So that an older bird would have that going for it. But other than that, I don't know. I mean, birds have temperaments. They really do.
Don't we all? I
Yes.
love the temperament of some of the scrub jays. Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, questions here. Are there any jays known at the Balm Scrub or any plans of locating birds to Balm Scrub?
There are no scrub jays there that I know about, that I've heard about. I certainly haven't had David Gordon tell me that they're there. I am certain that the county staff are looking for them, have an eye out for them. They are working hard to restore the habitat. There are no plans. So like analogous to the Rookery Bay saga, it was a big failed experiment to transport scrub jays to a site that had no jays. So that would be very, very low priority for FWC to translocate jays to Bon Voyette because there aren't any scrub jays there now. They're unlikely to stick. They're unlikely to stay there. So that would be seen as high risk, I think.
Okay. And talking about specific locations, someone went to Oscar Scherer State Park and did not see a single scrub jay, and that used to be a really reliable place. Do you have any info on this park regarding jays?
So Oscar is an interesting case study. There's an analog for it, Lyonia Preserve in Deltona. So Oscar Scherer has however many acres of scrub that it has. As the land surrounding the park began developing, into pretty dense residential areas, the scrub jays that were inside the park, the numbers began increasing fairly dramatically to the point where the habitat was super saturated. There were too many jays. Unfortunately, a lot of people remember how many scrub jays there were. So over time, the number of jays has started to decline back to what is, closer to the actual carrying capacity of the scrub there. And now people, see fewer scrub jays, so they think they've declined. In reality, it's probably closer to what the carrying capacity really is. Same things happened at Lyonia, which is surrounded by Deltona development. The number of jays just shot way up. And I mean, the territory sizes were under 10 acres. The birds were just jammed in there. And now, and over time, the number of, jays has been dropping off. And there's a lot of concern about it, but there is a stable, there's a carrying capacity for those sites. So the jays are there, if you don't see them in Oscar Share, you probably should ask at the office. There are still at least 6 family groups at Oscar Sharer.
Yeah, you just have to walk further to find them.
You probably have, that's probably what it is. That's
But
probably what
I mean,
it is.
that was been my experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the dangers of inbreeding? And I would add, you said that at Archibald, they're starting to see inbreeding. What kinds of effects are they seeing?
It's shows up initially as lower hatching rates. Fewer eggs hatch. So they'll lay the eggs, but they don't hatch. So they're what do you call it? Like sterile eggs.
Infertile, yeah.
Infertile eggs. Yeah, it's mostly like that. Some deformities, but mostly it's lower hatching rate right now. It's sort of one of the early telltale signs. And they've got, 45, 48 years worth of data. So they know what the hatching rates were historically.
Okay. What about captive breeding?
Well, there's no real impetus for that right now because there are, there are 8,000 jays. We didn't start breeding, captive breeding Florida scrub jays. Admittedly, maybe it was late, but 200 birds. So it's a big difference there. Right now, it's not seen as, translocation is much more cost effective than captive breeding.
Okay. That sort of surprises me, but what do I know? How is climate change affecting scrub jays?
Well, that will be better known over time. There's a lot of discussion about that. A drier climate would decrease the abundance of insects and arthropods that are critically important for feeding the young birds, the nestlings and the young birds, so that they can grow. They need those high protein insect fixes. So lower moisture, same thing, drought, heavier moisture, longer storms, longer rainfall periods, heavy rainfall will flood their habitat. It will cause the acorns to rot. It will inhibit their ability to forage, to find food. It's just, there are a lot of variables. Temperature, whether it's hotter and drier or hotter and wetter, makes a big difference.
Yeah, I can see it affecting, so many of the plants as well.
Mm-hmm.
How frequently are long distance migrants seen?
Well, through the J-Watch program, we have had some birds in Sarasota County move 10 and 12 miles. 2 are from Oscar Sharer and the South Venice Lemon Bay Preserve. There have also been some movements of birds between Sarasota County parks and Manatee County parks that are fairly long, 10 miles or more. So it does occur. In the case of that area, it is probably indicates that they're desperate for mates. They're young birds, they're desperate for mates. There aren't many birds unless parks left, especially in Sarasota County. So the young birds are the ones that are more inclined to, go on longer forays in search of, better habitat. and mates.
This was not one of the questions that's in the chat box, but I'm going to piggyback on that. Do you know if there's any difference in like average distance migration between the birds in Archibald compared to the birds up in Ocala, for example, that's a much bigger overall area?
You mean dispersal distances?
Right, or long distance migration. What would be considered long distance in Archibald? Is that the same distance, long distance as in Ocala, where they're not so constricted?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer it exactly. So Ocala National Forest, the birds are in clear-cut patches. So the way they harvest, it's forest, right? So they clear-cut patches, and that's where the jays move, actually, when they clear-cut. So they're fairly dense, in the clear-cut areas, but they're patches, but they can move around between patches. So at Archbold, the lands that belong to FWC, all the different reserves that, it's a whole patchwork of reserves that surround Archbold, both north and south. It's kind of similar, the same thing. So a mile or two is all they have to move, and they do from Archbold. You see when we do Jaywatch surveys down there, we'll find birds that were abandoned on Archbold on those FWC properties. So they move back and forth, and some of them move from FWC properties onto Archbold. So I would say the distances are fairly similar.
Okay.
Not dramatically different.
Yeah. Are there any breeding rituals with scrub jays?
Boy, that's a good question. There's a whole whispery, they have this little whispery vocalization, apparently, when they're courting. They walk around and make this real, it's supposed to be, I have not heard it. I have to tell you, I haven't heard it. But it's, the birds do this, it's sort of their own song. Almost, if you can imagine. Scrub jays don't really sing, but it's sort of this whispery thing that they do when they're courting. I don't know. I think they do mate feeding, things like that, but nothing real dramatic like oyster catchers do.
I don't think I've ever seen breeding rituals of oyster catchers. What is that? As dramatic?
It's exciting. They walk side by side and they raise and lower. They do this little parallel dance thing and they make a racket. They call so loud, and they walk and they touch their bills to the ground and they raise them to the sky and they walk around in a circle, the two of them. It's really neat to see. It is.
Huh.
Only seen it once, but it was just, my mouth was hanging open, I think. I was fascinated.
So folks, there's a challenge for us that are out and around the bay where there are oyster catchers. Keep an eye out for them.
So how many Jay watchers are on tonight with us? I see Doug and Mary.
Yeah. So folks, you've got down in the bottom, you've got a reactions button. Hit the thumbs up button if you're a Jay watcher, if you've done Jay watch with us.
There you go. Jackie, look at Jackie. Very good. Well, y'all need to come out. Help us with Jay watch.
Yes. It's very interesting. And what I have done with Jay watch is every year, well, I go to Moody Branch every year. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, I try to go to different places across the state just to get to see different places. So I've been over at Lake Monroe and up at Halpata, Tastanaki, and just a whole bunch of places. And it's very interesting. in a way, how different, but yet how similar the different
Mhm,
areas look.
mhm.
And
It
I don't know, is there anybody here who goes birding out at Cheeto Branch? It's a Swift Mud property, southeast of Brandon. I have been out there twice, and man, that looks like it ought to be some good scrub jay territory. I haven't found a bird there, jay there yet, but some parts of it just look wonderful. Yeah, Lillian, go ahead.
Doug and I have birded Cheeto several times in the past year. Never seen it. Never seen any scrub jays.
Yeah, I haven't either, but every time I'm there, I'm looking for jays because it looks like they ought to be there. Okay, any other questions?
Somebody asked a question about Amazon and Duet. Is there an Amazon warehouse that's supposed to be built near in eastern Manatee County? Was that what I understood from the question?
No, I didn't see that. I don't know who asked the question.
Carol asked, is Duet the best place to see scrub jays for sure?
Well, and I answered her in the chat box. There are a lot of jays there. Duet is open to the public 2 weekends a month. I think you still have to register or get a permit from Manatee County. And to get out to the area where the jays are, you really need an all-wheel drive, a four-wheel drive vehicle that can ford at least one stream, because from the entrance to get to, so the entrance is on the northeast side of this huge property. The birds are mostly on the western and southwestern side of the property, and you have to ford at least one stream to get there. So it's not easy access.
Isn't there a wagon tour though, where they
Well,
see scrub jays?
you can make arrangements sometimes. We actually did that one year for the Florida Birding and Nature Festival. So I don't think it's a regular event. I think it's something that you can set up.
Pre-COVID, Manatee County ran a wagon tour. I don't know how regularly, but at least fairly often in there.
Okay, but did they go the whole way back to the scrub jay property? Because when I did one of their trips, we didn't get, I helped out at Manatee at Duet for 3 months, trap training jays for banding for Quest. And the tour that I went on did not take us far enough out to get to the jay territory. So do you know, Doug?
I remember going on the wagon there on at least one trip and finding jays, but I don't remember if that was just a county general public tour or if it was something that was set up as part of the Jay Watch training.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I think, well, no, because I did a Jay Watch training there, but I was on another one at some point. Sandy Townsend put in the chat that you can purchase a pass that will allow you to access Duet Preserve any day of the week. That's true. Just be sure it's not a hunting weekend, because they do allow hunting out there. So there's some days that you might not want to be there.
You also have to call every week to get the new code.
They'll tell you if there's hunting.
And they usually when you call, they'll tell you if there's hunting.
Okay, so you get the new code for
And be sure to let somebody know you're going in there, because there are areas that you can really get in trouble back there. The roads are not always great.
Yeah. There is an additional entrance north of the main gated entrance where you can park and walk in. It's a straight walk, but it's soft sand. It's not all that far, but it's still in soft sand, a decent hike. And there are a few jays back in there in that north section. But again, they're not easily accessible. So, any other questions?
I have a quick one. Mary Ann, are you going to have an active J Watch program this year that we can sign up for?
I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure hoping so. So if, what one of the things we're wrestling with is, last year, people over 65 were discouraged from even leaving home. Well, this year, people over 65, more and more are getting vaccines. So we're actually, could be biased in the opposite direction this year to people who are, older and who've had vaccines. And I'm one of them. Yay. So, we're looking at that right now and figuring out, well, we'll have to still do, masks and social distancing and figure out the transportation. But I think, I think it's entirely doable in certain areas, certainly like down in Highlands County. And we can break up in teams and take separate vehicles, that kind of thing. We're working on it, Doug.
Good.
Let us know. Let us
Fingers-
know. We're ready.
Yes. Fingers crossed. Right.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I'll mention one other thing. We do have some webinars on Florida Scrub Jay ecology and Jaywatch on our website. That's fl.audubon.org. And you click on the toolbar about us. And there's a drop down menu and it says educational webinars.
Okay.
Great. Okay. And I will also note, Oscar Shearer, I have seen jays in Oscar Shearer within the last year. And another place that not many people go to is called Moody Branch. It is right across the county line in Manatee. You go east out of Waimama, south on Grange Road, and then there's another, and I'd have to look it up, but there is a public parking area and you have to walk through a hammock area, forested area before you get out to the jays. But it's got, what, Mary Ann, 5 or 6 families? 4?
5 families.
5
Yeah.
families?
Yeah, and they're growing. It's the jay numbers are growing out there.
Yeah. If anybody is interested and wants directions, email me and I will give you directions for getting there too. Because that's another place within an easy drive, but you're going to get your exercise with the walking. All right, Mary Ann, thank you so very, very much. I want to
Thank
acknowledge
you.
Jackie Sulik from Audubon, Florida, also joined in. So,
Well, yes, I should have introduced Jackie. She is our Jaywatch coordinator at Audubon, Florida. So thank you, Jackie, for attending with your bird jeepers.
All right. Well, folks, thank you all very, very much. Somebody here says they saw Jays at Oscar Shearer in December, so that's not too far back. Remember, next month,
Jackie.
our program will be native plants and native habitat for native birds. So be sure to check in then. And thank you. This, Marianne did give us permission. And so a tape of this there will be a link on the website if anybody else wants to check in and see it again, or anybody who missed it, you can tell them they'll be able to find it there. And be sure to save your best photos and get them ready for the photo contest. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to end the meeting. So everybody have a good evening and stay safe.